Good afternoon. How you guys doing? Good. So you've been at home. Aren't you glad to be back? Folks online again, we've got folks here in the live audience, so we're not making fun of you guys. All right, we'll get started in just a second. Okay, so I'm Michael Mann. We're going to spend about 40 minutes. And the purpose of this, I've got folks joining us late. So it's supposed to start at 12 or 1 o'clock, probably their time. So I'm clicking as they come on. So you guys just come in, have a seat. I'll kind of roll through this very quickly so the folks online are not held over. We'll talk about 30 to 40 minutes on this. We'll roll through. If you have questions, please ask. Folks online, you can email us questions, or you can ask. Take yourself off mute if you want to, or send that. Can they send a chat through here, Scott, if they have a question or no? Yeah. And just send us a message. We'll answer the question. Scott's monitoring this also. Folks out here in the audience, you have a question, please be sure to raise your hand. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit different than what you guys have been taught or what you're used to. Okay, and I'll tell you why that is. So we're about 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes. Preventing violence in private schools. We'll have a Q&A at the end, but folks in the audience, if you have a question, please ask that question anytime. We'll answer it. I'll repeat it so the folks online can hear the question because they may have the same question. They may be interested in what you have to ask. Okay. All right. Real quick, we're going to talk about threat assessments. We'll talk about risk factors. We're going to talk about law enforcement response, how that's changing, what that looks like. We're going to talk about understanding the threat, which is the most important thing for you folks, because this is against the Western mindset, which I'm about to talk about. Western mindset for us, because we have so much stuff, is we wait for somebody to do something else for us. So I'm going to try to get you away from that mindset because it's not working. It's never worked. It hasn't worked from the beginning after the fall. It doesn't work now. And so we're going to get away from that. I'm going to give you guys a little bit different mindset about what this looks like and the idea of really what this threat looks like to you guys. Okay. We'll talk about a template for prevention also. That's something that Scott can get with you on later. It's just some basics as you guys get to understand some things maybe or hear some things that you've not heard before. Okay. So I come from an extensive background in design and physical protection program. So I'm a Marine Corps veteran. I was in Fast Company. When I was a kid, I was out conducting anti-terrorism operations all over the world for the Marine Corps for the United States. I came back here to Nashville and went to college and was a police officer here, was a SWAT guy and an intelligence guy in Nashville. And then I got smart and then went away and went back to work for the government and did that for about 6 years for the Department of Energy. And then went back to school, to graduate school, majoring in this. And then started designing these programs for big companies. So nuclear and chemical companies who were government regulated because of things that they were selling. So special nuclear material, fuel, that kind of stuff. So to keep the reactors running and to keep some of our critical infrastructure running. Did some other overseas travel and study in Europe and terrorism very specifically as I was working for these companies. And in 2011, this is kind of where all this changed for me. So there was a study program in Israel, and I was working for a very large global company at the time. And I convinced them to send me there because I'd always wanted to go to Israel, one, and it was in the budget, number two. And three, I wanted to hear, how they looked at things differently than we do or than we did, because I'd always heard that. And so what happened was I got on an airplane and went over there and spent a couple of weeks with a group of other security professionals. I was the only American or somebody from the United States that was there. There were Canadians there from intelligence agencies. There were intelligence folks from Greece, from Singapore, from other countries. And so what would happen, we would go into a room at Tel Aviv University, and all these experts in terrorism would come in, and they would spend the morning talking to us about how they combat terrorism, how they look at their adversaries. And then we would leave in the afternoon, and we would go do these field studies on everything from how to protect critical infrastructure, border crossings, terrorist attacks, you name it. Anything that they are involved with, we got to see that close up, protecting airports, whatever. And so the first day I was in this training, sitting in this class with all these folks I didn't know, this professor, this Israeli professor who's an expert in terrorism comes up, and he makes a comment about the United States. And he said, in America, he said, there are people that walk into buildings, in schools, in classrooms, and they shoot people and they kill them, but they're not terrorists. And then he went into this kind of mindset of the way that we think about things and the way they think about things. And basically the way they think about things is that they try to prevent it before it happens because they've had to learn the hard way. And so then we went into behavioral threat detection. And so I learned how to do that. We went to all these other things throughout that study period. And so when I came back, I started to implement this in the security programs that I designed. And we started seeing things, or the security team saw things they didn't notice or see before. And so right after Sandy Hook, a large affluent private school in a county just south of here, they contacted me right after Sandy Hook and asked me to put an ARM program together for them for their school. And then a second large school way out in the same county, another big school, asked me to do the same thing. And so while I was putting those programs together, their response programs, I asked about the detection and the behavioral piece of it. And they really didn't care about that. They were worried about guns and somebody reacting to an active shooter. And so what I got out of this was that it's not about us responding, and that's what we do here. Like a problem happens and we throw something at it, or really what we do as Americans, we pick up the phone and we call somebody else because we're lazy. Like we want everybody else to solve our problems. And so the idea here is that we want to solve this 2 weeks or 2 months before it happens, especially at a school. Okay. So let me kind of go over that. First, I want you to understand like threat. We talk about threat. Threat is the intent and capability of someone to do something bad to the school or to you. Okay. Now, this is going to be important later on for behavioral detection when I just talk about prevention, because intent, like for me to know your intent about like what you intend to do when you leave here, I have no idea what that means, right? Because I can't read your mind. All I can do is look at your behavior and what you say to determine what your intent is. And then capability for schools, for you guys, it's better because you know your students. You may know the adversary, and we're going to get into that. So the threat is the intent and capability for somebody to do something bad to your facility or to somebody you're trying to protect, okay? So there are two types of threats very specifically, especially when we talk about schools, but for government facilities also. There are insider threats and outsider threats. And this is going to come into play here when we start talking about like the danger of you here in this school, if there is any, okay? And so an insider threat is someone by definition that has information about your protection system. So like they work at your location, they go to school there, or they do something there that requires them, number one, to have access so that, they're allowed to come in, number one. And number two, they know about how things work. That's an insider threat. So give me an example of an insider threat at this school. Like if there was one, what's an example? There's a lot of them. What's one example of an insider threat? Yeah, a student. Did you have another? Yeah, or just a teacher. Yeah, I mean, I think all teachers are angry at some point, right? It's a joke, folks. It's a joke. Okay, all right. So yeah, it could be an angry teacher because we're going to get into that. So it could be someone that's angry that works here. It could be a student, right? And so an insider threat is someone that has access and that has knowledge of your system, like how things work. Like you let them in here every day and they know how everything, what happens at 8 o'clock, what happens at 3 o'clock. An outsider threat is somebody that doesn't have access. They don't know a whole lot about what happens in here, but we're going to talk about they still gather information just like the insider does. So you have insider threats and outsider threats. Requirements for a successful attack. Let me go over that just real quick. This will be important later on. Okay, so I try to give you building blocks over the next 40 minutes. So before anybody can, whether it's a student or like an angry teacher, okay, or anybody, even an outsider, somebody that has a problem with the cross, right? Because the cross is offensive. It always has been. This is a Christian school. There's a cross outside somewhere, at least on a flag anyway, okay? So because that's always been offensive, so there may be somebody that doesn't like that. So whether it's an outsider that doesn't like the school because of what you stand for, or whether it's an insider like a teacher or a student, there are 4 requirements for them to be successful. This is important for later on. Number one, they have to have information about this school. Like whether they're in here, like they have access, or they don't have access, they have to have information about the school. Something. They have to know how they're going to get in, how they're going to get out, what time you open up, how many students are here, like at 12 o'clock, how many people you have in the cafeteria. They need to know that stuff, whether they work here or whether they don't work here or they're a student here. Number two, they have to have the element of surprise, which means you're not expecting it. And these are the 2 biggest issues we have really with active shooters is, even though there's information that comes out before and people see it, they don't understand what it is. And when the bad thing happens, it's a surprise. And then people get hurt and sometimes get killed. Number 3, they have to be in control. How do you think that an active shooter is in control in a situation? Anybody? Yeah, they have a weapon. Yeah, they have a gun. That's going to be important later on too when we discuss what your strategy is. So they have to be in control of the situation. And then number four, they have to be mobile. They have to be able to move around. If I take any of those elements away, it's going to be very difficult for them to conduct the attack. And what we have done, this became a big deal in 1999. Does anybody know in 1999 what happened? Yeah, Columbine happened. All right. So that was the big one where you had two insider threats that were in a school for 40 plus minutes, and the police showed up and they had a kind of a different strategy then. It's kind of the same now, really. And they waited, and then finally they went in, and by the time they got in, there were a lot of victims, right? A lot of casualties. And then at some point before they were able to get to those two students, the students committed suicide. So that was a big event. It took the police a long time. There were people, you saw it on the news. It was broadcasted. It was very emotional. And so there was a lot of push to change things in 99. That's when, now like in this area, we started seeing school resource officers in the mid 90s. But, for some places, 99 was that's when it all kind of started for a lot of folks. Okay. So again, whether it's an insider, hold on one second, we got somebody coming in here. Okay. Whether that's an insider or outsider, they have to have information. They have to have the element of surprise. They must be in control, and they must be able to move around. Okay. All right. So let's get into a real quick. Let's talk about risk. I want to get into a couple things. First, some terms. So I'm going to throw these words out to you, and I want you to know what they mean. So risk is your exposure to a hazard. Okay, that's what risk means. It's you or the school's exposure to some kind of hazard. And here, what we're talking about is like this violent, event, or this mass casualty event. School, like when we get into statistics here in a second, because we're going to talk about like your likelihood or your risk for this, and it's really low. It's low for all schools, but the idea of a school in the studies is like K through 12th grade. Okay, so that's a school. An institute of higher education, an IHE, would be like something that's after high school. So that could be like a 2-year community college. It could be a 4-year university. It could be a trade school. So that's when we talk about IHEs, or Institute of like higher education or learning. That's what we're talking about. We're going to focus just on the schools because that's what's here, right? What grade does a school start at? It's a preschool, and it goes up to like 12th grade, right? Okay. All right. And then elements of risk. So likelihood is like the probability of this like likelihood in my world is threat. Like, what is your threat? Like the probability of something happening. Then there is vulnerability, which is something that you're not doing. That's like a system weakness, something you're not doing to deal with this. And consequence, which is really the worst part of this, is your impact, the impact this has. And you're going to see what impact looks like of active shooters at a school. And so that's something we can't change. No matter how much we lower the likelihood or vulnerability, like if it happens, we don't change the impact. Okay. So we can't change yet. Now we can lower the score on the other two, but the consequence is always going to be there. Okay. All right. So let's just real quick, I want you to understand, because I don't know what training you've had before, but a lot of this is always wrapped around like when you leave, you think somebody's going to break in the building, like with a bazooka, start shooting people or something, like when you leave. And I will tell you that's really not the case. The likelihood of that's very low. So let me just kind of show you what this means, okay? So from 2000 to 2017, if I look at active shooter attacks in schools, not institutes of higher education or learning, when we talk about from 2000 to 2017, there were 38 active shooter attacks in schools in those 17 years. Now, does anybody know how many like public schools there are in the U.S.? Can anybody guess? 18,000. Yeah. What, anybody else? Yeah, somebody said, I heard something. Somebody says, huh? Yeah, it's 100,000 plus. It's like 110,000 public schools in the U.S. And then when you look at private schools, the last time I looked, there's like 35,000 private schools. And then there's charter schools. So let's just say there's about 150 schools, like pre-K or K through 12 in the U.S. In those 17 years, there were 38 active shooter attacks. Now, what do you think the likelihood really? So if you got 140 plus thousand schools in the United States, and in 17 years there were 38 active shooter attacks, what do you think the likelihood of an attack is to happen? What do you think? Yeah, it's not very high, is it? Right. So yeah, exactly. So what's more likely here? A tornado, a flood. Like, a flood came through it 10 years ago and floated the school, like the school floated away. That's more likely to happen again than an active shooter is. Okay. Now, here's the thing with these active shooter events. Not one of those events in those 17 years happened in a private school. They were all at public schools. The only non-public school, and I don't know why they listed it in the statistics, but there was an Amish school in Pennsylvania where they listed as an active shooter attack, but it wasn't. What happened was someone came in, it was like a hostage barricade situation that turned in basically to an assassination. He killed several of the students, okay? So it wasn't an active shooter attack by definition. And it really wasn't even a private school. It was like this little kind of school that was in the Amish part of the country. And so it wasn't really considered private. It was, those are the people that live there. So that was the only difference. So in those 17 years, they were all public schools. There wasn't a private school that had been attacked, okay? Out of those 38 attacks, 34 of those adversaries, and adversary is the bad guy, okay? They were insider threats. And the majority of those were students. So like 30 plus were students. You had a couple of, somebody said angry teachers. You had at least one angry teacher, okay? And then you had like a staff member that was not a teacher. And then the other 4 were outsiders, and one very specifically was a domestic situation. So it was an outsider, and we call this in collusion with an insider, means he got information about the school from the girlfriend, and he was angry at her, and he came in and shot and killed her, and I think he shot and killed a couple of others, okay? And then the others were mentally ill outsiders. So they had targeted the school, one for an unknown reason, and then we're going to get into one of the others. So no private schools in those 17 years. Out of those 38 attacks, out of the 140,000 plus schools, 34 of those attackers came from the school, okay? Now I'm not saying when school starts back, start patting the kids down. I'm just letting you know statistically, this is your threat spectrum, what this looks like, okay? So that's likelihood it's low, right? So you agree that that's low? Yeah, okay. So let's talk about vulnerability, all right? So vulnerability is something you're not doing, like a system weakness. Like you guys have had some kind of active shooter training, right? You guys have had something, okay? So vulnerability is something you're not doing. So the questions you want to ask are how do you escape from a violent event? You guys have covered that, correct? So one vulnerability might be, especially with the strategy that we have right now, or most schools is, what is that strategy, by the way? What is the strategy of the schools today? Can somebody tell me? Tell me the strategy of most active shooter events. What's yours? I'm just curious. Huh? Right. So, but it has to happen first, correct? Yep. So it happens. So, and somebody tell me if I'm wrong, I don't know. So I'm guessing. So you hear gunfire, right? So yeah. So you hear something and then you guys respond, right? Right. Disperse. Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So you wait for a signal and then you guys are dispersing. Well, what I mean by signals, you hear gunfire, you hear something, okay? So some of your vulnerabilities might be how do you escape? How do you get out? You guys have covered that. How do you hide from somebody that's in control and mobile? How do you hide from somebody if you can't get out, right? So I guess somebody covered, if you can't leave, you're going to have to probably hide or barricade or something maybe, okay? So how do you do that with somebody that's inside the building that's in control? And then, the next vulnerability might be, look, as a last resort, which I'm sure they covered, if you don't have any other choice, how in the world, if you're unarmed, are you going to fight an armed person? What does that look like? So those are some of the vulnerabilities that probably somebody went over with you, correct? Okay. All right. I promise I'm going somewhere with this, okay? And so the next piece, sorry about that, is going to be consequence. And we talked about this already, okay? consequences that impact, and you're going to see impact here in just a minute. And when we mean what we mean by impact, that's always based on, well, it's based on two big things. Number one, that is when we talk about criticality, like how important something is, it's based on, number one, cost, like how much does this cost us? Like if this happens, how much is this going to cost? Number one. And number two, can we replace it? Like the asset that were lost or that was lost, can it be replaced? And the problem, like with active shooter events, like if I work in a plant and somebody blows up the generator, I can go buy another generator. You know, we can replace the generator. We've got insurance, we can replace that. The problem with active shooters is, like if it's a student or a teacher or staff member or somebody else and they die, we can't replace them. Like the cost goes beyond measure, and two, we can't replace them. So that's a critical asset. And so with active shooter events, as you guys know, this is a big deal. All right, so we start talking about the risk process. And then there's always this impact, which I'm going to show you in just a second. There's different types of impact for this. Number one, there's a social impact. What does that mean for you guys? What is a social impact for the school if there was an active shooter here? Tell me what the social impact would be. Yeah. He covered it. Just throw your mask at him. He keeps answering your questions. I know. All right. So yeah, what would be another social impact outside of fear? And tell me the result of fear. Huh? It sure is. Boy, it's like running amok right now, isn't it? Okay. And so it's contagious. And what does that mean for you guys? You're going to see an example of it here in just a minute on the video. What does that mean for you guys if it's contagious? Chaos and what else? Like, you know, there's an active shooter here tomorrow. Everybody's afraid to come back. What's that mean? Yeah, nobody's here. Like, you know, you're going to go home. You may not get to come back. You got to shut the school down. Like COVID did that. Or that's what they want you to think anyway. Okay. So like, you know, there's some kind of impact here. All right. So yeah, so social impact is fear, which again means, hey, like we're not going to open the school back up again. And you're going to see what I mean by this. Personal. What's a personal impact? What would that mean? Tell me something personal. Yeah, like there's a psychological impact personally on somebody because they saw something that they never expected to see, or they experienced something that they had never expected to experience. Okay. What would be another personal impact to this? Absolutely. Yeah, like serious bodily injury, like you could recover. Ma'am, you raised your hand. Okay, no, okay. All right. And then, of course, there's the financial impact. You're going to see this in just a second. Tell me about the financial impact of this. Yep, no students. What if they damage a lot of stuff? What's that mean? Yeah, you got to fix the damage. Okay. You guys remember Sandy Hook Elementary School? Remember that? So let me kind of go over that. Now, I want you to hear the impact of Sandy Hook. I'm going to explain this to you so you understand this risk piece. Again, this is low for you guys, but can it happen? It could happen. Okay. So let's talk about Sandy Hook real quick. So somebody that went to school there a long time ago, and I don't think it had anything to do, the attack had nothing to do with what happened to him when he was in first grade, but he decided to attack that school. And so about 9:30 one morning, so you guys understand, Sandy Hook Elementary School was very secure. Like all the doors were locked, and then there was a front door that had a camera on it, and then there was a device that kept the door locked. Like somebody had to bust somebody in to get through the door. And the adversary, Adam Lanza, knew that. And so it's about 9:30 one morning, and Adam Lanza shows up in this black Honda, and he gets out, and he pops the trunk, and he takes some weapons out, and he walks up, the doors locked, there's a camera there. And he starts to shoot his way in. Now, a couple of weeks prior to this, there was like the state of Connecticut, like all states, for public schools specifically, had some sort of an active shooter, like they had to go through some kind of mandatory exercise, some kind of drill. And so the lady that you're about to hear speak, she was part of that drill, and just happened that day. So she's a kindergarten teacher, and her door was shut, like her classroom door was closed. And if I remember, according to the report, I think she even had like the little blinds down, like on her window. Like I think that's where she had left them after the drill. She didn't think about it, and the door was closed or partially closed. So he pulls up about 9:30, and he starts to shoot his way into the building. Now they've had a drill. So you guys hear gunfire. What are you doing? You Tell me, what are you doing? You hear gunfire. What have you been taught to do? Leave the building. Get out, right? What else? Anything else? Put magnets over the windows? Curtains, right? So that, like to hide yourself. Okay. Anything else? Yep. Okay, so you're going to be aware of what happens, position yourself in the room, that way if you have to get out, okay? Yep. Okay, so add a line of fire, okay? So here's what happens. So first of all, you guys are teachers. You guys know what the limbic system is? You ever heard of the limbic system? Yep. So it's the part of the brain that does what? Does anybody know what the limbic system does? Like, it's God-given, it protects us, really. Yeah, it's like fight, flight, or freeze. Anybody ever run over a deer, hit a deer with your car? Anybody ever hit a deer? Okay. Yeah. What happens when the deer runs out in front of your car? Yeah. What's it doing? It's freezing, but why is it freezing? Yeah. It's trying to process what's happening. So it didn't expect you to be there. It jumps out in front of you. And as you go to hit the deer, it sits there trying to assess what happens. That's what's happening with you guys when you hear gunfire. Like, depending on how much training you've had, like what your personal experiences are, you might run away, you might freeze up, maybe you do get ready to fight. Well, here's what happened in Sandy Hook. So it started, so the gunfire starts, he's shooting his way in the building, and some of the people hid, and then there was a group of people in a room, and I think it included the principal and school psychologist, and they were having a meeting with some parents, and they heard the gunfire. Now, they had just had a drill like a week or 2 weeks before, and so same thing, they're supposed to kind of like lock down and get behind barricades or get out of the school. And then, if they run into the active shooter, there's this discussion about fighting someone, okay? And so the school psychologist, I think it was a principal, and I don't know it's because that they didn't believe it was gunfire, they didn't know, but they told the parents to stay in that room, and they went running down the hallway to investigate, and I think they were the first two victims. Now, as Adam Lance is coming into the school and he sees his first two victims, he passes this teacher's classroom. He doesn't look at it. He doesn't have any idea that anybody's in it, but she hears the gunfire, okay? And so this continues, and I'll kind of go through the response real quick, and I want you to hear what she has to say. And then so this goes on for an extended amount of time. And some people in the office have kind of turned the loudspeaker on, and so like people in the rest of the school can hear what's happening, because maybe in the back of the school, it's a pretty good sized school, they can't hear everything, they don't know. And so somewhere about 5 minutes into this, like 5 minutes into the attack, really at 9:35, the first 911 call comes into the police department. Now, Sandy Hook's not a big town. It's like probably the size of Nolensville. So it's not big. And so, there's like a couple police officers working, and they dispatch those police officers. And once they're dispatched, now he's been there 5 minutes shooting, there's a call that goes out, and they get there in about 3 minutes. So it's like 9:38. But all this mayhem is happening, okay? So what ends up happening is at 9:38, they pull into the parking lot, but they don't get in the building until 9:44. There's stuff going on inside the parking lot, okay? So after, 9:38 to 9:44, that's about 7 minutes. They deal with something outside that's not a threat. They just don't know that. And then they get in, and by the time they do get in, then the event's over with, okay? And they deal with the consequence. So I'm going to play the video.
And I sat down with a first grade teacher at that school, Caitlin Roick. She heard gunfire, large windows exposed her classroom, so she managed to rush 15 small children into a tiny bathroom to try to save their lives.
I put one of my students on top of the toilet dispenser. I just knew we had to get in there. I was just telling them it's going to be okay. You're going to be all right. I had pulled a bookshelf before I closed the door in front of it. So it was we were completely barricaded in. I turned the lights off.
Did you tell them to be quiet? Did you worry about one of them?
No, I told them to be quiet. I told them we had to be absolutely quiet because I was just so afraid that if he did come in and then he would hear us and then he would maybe just start shooting the door. So I said, no, we just have to be absolutely quiet. And I said, there are bad guys out there now. We need to wait for the good guys. They're coming again. I wanted us to be okay. And I'm so saddened that there are people who in this situation are not okay. And my heart goes out to anyone who knew them and was a part of their lives. I just can't imagine.
Did they cry?
No, if they started crying, I would like take their face and say, "It's gonna be okay. Show me your smile." Like I really tried to and one of my students was, would say like things like, "I know karate, so it's okay. I'll lead the way out." Like
They really said to you, "We want to go home for Christmas."
Oh yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or I just want to hug my mom, or just things like that were just heartbreaking, and like in my mind, I mean, because you're hearing. I've never been a part of something, obviously, anywhere near this traumatic. And so I'm hearing the gunfire in the hallway, and I'm thinking in my mind, I'm the first classroom. Why isn't he coming? I'm thinking we're next. And, and in my mind, I'm thinking, as a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, what are your thoughts? What are your, and I'm thinking that I have to almost be their parent. Like I have to tell them, so I said to them, I need you to know that I love you all very much and that it's going to be okay, because I thought that was the last thing they were ever going to hear.
So again, when we start talking about response, the police and their ability to actually come and respond a year from now might be different based on what we have happening, okay? So response is somebody's ability to stop the threat. Like you guys kind of went over that too, right? Okay. So response is our ability to stop the threat. I want you guys to understand, when we start talking about the police, there's no requirement in the United States of America for the police to come in and do anything here. So if there was an active shooter in here right now, the police don't have a requirement to come in here and respond. Now they will, but there's not a requirement for them to do that, okay? What does it look like right now? You guys need to know this. For police officers, when they respond to an active shooter incident right now, 85% of the time, the incident's over before they get there. The other 14 to 15% of the time when they do get there, if the adversary is still inside that building shooting and they want to fight, and the police have to go in to do something, the police take a 46% casualty rate. Okay? So understand it's a very dangerous issue for the police. And when we start looking at like consequence for us, even though the likelihood's low, this is where vulnerability is very, very important, number one. And number two, we understand the consequence. And so if we're waiting on someone, remember we have some options, and one of those could be to wait on somebody to get here. That option may not be the best. Okay. This is really old. Tom Brokaw is like young. Okay. Oh, somebody's trying to jump in here. Okay. This is the police officer that was at Columbine the day of the attack. So he kind of had there was a dual role. He was a police officer. He was in uniform, but he also like coached or did something, I think, after school. And every day or several days out of the week, he would leave about lunchtime and go to like Subway and get a sandwich and come back. And so when the attack started, they were, you guys remember what kind of threats were at the Columbine attacker? There are two types. Yeah, but what kind of adversaries were they? Yeah, they were insider threats, right? Yep, they were students. And so what happened, they had planned to blow the school up. And the first IEDs didn't go off and provide explosive devices like they planned. And so that's why they started this armed attack. And as this starts off outside, the police officer, the school resource officer, is on his way back from lunch. And so he's there like an immediate response, and he goes to engage these two, 17-year-old kids, because the prom was the weekend before. They're about to graduate. Okay, so they're seniors. And I want you to hear what he has to say here on the video about as he responded to these two shooters, what it looked like for him. This is a police officer. He's been a police officer for a while. Okay. See if we get to play.
On the day of the massacre, shots were fired at the two young men by a Jefferson County Deputy Sheriff, Neil Gardner. He was patrolling the parking lot at the time. Gardner, who is also a coach at Columbine, described his chilling experience for the first time with Dateline's Sarah James.
Then I opened the door of the patrol car, and then as soon as I stood up, I saw a suspect enter the southwest doors of the school. As he exited,
I'd stay on Zoom, folks.
the doors, he started to shoot with an assault rifle.
Do you know who he was? Did you recognize him?
I recognize him as, since in between times we were hearing that the suspects could be Eric Harris or Dylan Klebold.
Where was that information coming
From kids running out of the school and on the school radio, because there was people inside of the school.
Were those names you knew?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as part of they called themselves the Trench Coat Mafia.
He was armed with an assault rifle. How were you armed?
I have a .45 semi-automatic pistol.
You were pretty outgunned. Did he see you, Neil? Was he shooting directly at you, or was he shooting in general?
Yes, he was, because we could hear the bullets fly over, and we could feel them go underneath the Blazer.
How close did they get?
A couple hit the front windshield. One hit the passenger rearview mirror, and the glass was falling down onto my shoulders.
In your 16 years on this force, have you ever experienced anything like this?
Never. This was the worst nightmare of my life.
And inside that school, Neil, that diary suggests that they wanted to kill 500 people.
I think with exchanging fire, it did allow some people that were fleeing the scene to get out of the building. I always will have to live with the fact that maybe if I could have dropped him, maybe it would have saved one or two more lives. I will never know.
So here's a situation where there's a police officer's there, right? So he's there, he's armed. And so I will tell you, guns don't prevent attacks. They don't. We're going to get into that in just a few minutes. And so with all the power outages, we have to slow down and come back and forth with this thing. But guns don't stop attack. They don't stop an attack. Really, being aware of what's going to happen is what stops it. And the deterrence is that they know, whether it's a student or outsider, that you know it's going to happen and that you're going to do something to stop it before it turns into an attack. You guys, we'll kind of go past this, but this is the Parkland attack. You guys can see the video on Zoom. This situation happened a couple years ago with a police officer that was there. The school resource officer did not respond. And so the police department, tried to discipline him. There were several lawsuits against him, and all those lawsuits were dismissed because, again, this has been to the Supreme Court before. Even though the police officer's there, there's no requirement for that officer to actually respond to save any of us from personal violence. And so don't know why he didn't do it. I can tell you from experience being inside of a room with armed people shooting, it's not the most, loving thing or something that you want to experience. So I'm sure he probably never experienced that before in his 30 years. He's been a police officer for a long time. And so there was a big investigation. You see the video. He didn't go inside. He kind of called for help and waited outside. And there's always been a lot of questions as, could he have stopped the shooter? Who knows? He could have just been another victim. Okay, so kind of give you guys your vulnerabilities, waiting on the police, like what it looks like if you think you have to get out. If you don't have that set up, what does that mean? So here's the important piece of this for you guys to kind of start changing your mindset, okay? And this has been from the very beginning. All of these folks are going to plan this, even the students, like the 14-year-old students that have been successful at killing 3 to 4 or 5 other students and attacking police officers in schools. Just like a terrorist, they go through an attack cycle process. And what that means is, even though with very little training or no training, maybe they've never even picked up a handgun before, they'll go through the process of walking through the school, gathering information, getting information from you that you don't know about to figure out how to conduct this attack. Klebold and Harris did it in Columbine. Every student in history that's attacked a school has gone through the same process. And so the good thing about it is there's parts of that you can detect. This is how we stop an active shooter, not with the weapons, because the guns aren't going to stop or prevent anything. If weapons prevented violence, we wouldn't have any school attacks. I mean, there's police officers in these schools. The majority of the school attacks that happened in those 17 years were at middle schools and high schools where there were school resource officers. The school resource officers' presence did not stop the attack. It was because the insider threat or the outsider was able to, number one, gather information they needed for the attack. Number two, it was such a surprise when they started the attack. Number three, they were in control because they had a weapon. And number four, they were able to move around. That's why they were successful. And so, yes, a 14-year-old kid will go through the same process. This started in the beginning with us after the fall. the first murder ever committed when we start talking about human beings was the son of Adam and Eve. And so that was committed out of anger. It was committed out of sin. And he went through the same process. If you read Genesis 4, it will very specifically say, depending on what translation you're reading, it says, Cain. So what did Cain do? Does anybody know before I tell you this? What did Cain do? What was his job? It's kind of parallel with his father, both of them, after the fall. What did Cain do? He was what? Yeah, he was a farmer. He dealt with the soil. What did his brother Abel do? Say again? Yeah, he took care of the animals. So like he had dominion over the animals. So it's these parallels with his father after the fall, right? I mean, both of them. And so Abel's over here out here in the fields, or way out of way with the animals every day, while Cain is here, dealing with the ground. And so obviously Cain, because he gets angry because in his own heart he didn't do what he was supposed to do. He gets mad over it. He's asked about it. God specifically asked him why he's angry. God tells him if he just do what he's supposed to do, he wouldn't be angry. And then later, I'm like a couple verses later, it says very specifically that Cain led his brother to the field. Like he went through a process. He went through this process and he killed his brother. And so when we start to ask, you mean a kid will go through this? Absolutely. Everybody can go through it. We're human beings. Whether you've had any training with it, whether you know anything about weapons, whether you know anything about killing, if you set through anger to do this, you will be successful. It's part of our fallen nature. Okay. So perfect example, outside of threat, Brandon O'Rourke, 2010, October 2010, Kelly Elementary School. Brandon O'Rourke is mentally ill. He actually targets an elementary school about 2 miles down the road from Kelly. So what he does is he goes through this process. He buys a weapon or a couple weapons. He buys a pistol, and then he has a gas can and a propane tank. His plan, because he's an outsider, he doesn't have access to the school, is wait for the kids to come out on the playground, throw those tanks in the playground, shoot a couple kids and shoot the tanks and blow the tanks up. He stops at the first elementary school to conduct surveillance. Like he's going through this process. And this process is, one, you got to select a target. Like, so if it's an insider, select a school. Number two, you got to gather information. Number three, you got to kind of look. We call that surveillance. Number four, you're going to go through the process of practicing. And all these kids do this, and the outsiders. And then at some point, you're going to attack the facility. And so that's what Brandon O'Rourke did. He's an outsider. He doesn't have access to the school. So he's going to attack the school from the outside. So he goes to an elementary school. He doesn't go to Keller Elementary first. He goes to another elementary school. When he pulls up to look at it to gather information, so it's a surprise, there are two teachers on the playground and they look at it. Now, they're not really looking at Brandon O'Rourke, but he thinks they are. And so what that does is that deters him from that school, and he goes down to Keller Elementary School. He watches it and no one sees him. And so he goes back and he attacks it. And he shoots two students in the playground. And luckily there were some innocent bystanders there. And they were able to, actually they tackled him. He tried to get away, and then they ran over him with their vehicle. And then they held him down and waited for the police to get there. As they were holding him down, he started screaming something about President Obama. This happened like in 2010. And so what happens especially if you've just shot somebody and you start screaming bad things about the President of the United States, who shows up? The U.S. Secret Service. So the U.S. Secret Service shows up to ask this guy questions. And they're like, hey, what does this have to do with the president? And they kind of find that he's mentally ill, but he tells them, well, I was going to attack this other school and the teacher saw me. And they're like, what are you talking about? And so they get with the local police. It was Carlsbad, California. They go back to the other elementary school. And what they found out was no teacher ever saw him. There were two teachers on the playground. They were trying to get away from the kids to have a conversation, and they turned away from them, and they looked in the parking lot where Brandon was parked. And he believed that he had been observed or seen. He believed he was going to be caught, and so he left. He believed his behavior had been detected, and so he left that school and went to a school where he believed he was not being watched. Okay? So when we talk about this idea of this attack methodology, the student will go through the same thing. They will decide, it's an example of this school. They will walk around and they will do things they normally don't do, and they will ask questions. At Columbine and every other school attacker, they've gone through the process. They wrote out notes. They did things online. They communicated things to their peers, to their peer groups. And teachers saw this and they ignored it. They either didn't know what it was or didn't take it seriously. students will do the same thing. So real quick to wrap this up, what does this look like for prevention? Okay. And then Scott's going to walk you guys through at some point to review some of the stuff that you guys have done before. So again, we talked about this. Prevention's about you guys actually convincing someone that wants to attack that you know about it, and that you don't even have to know. It just means you have to be aware of what's happening. You guys have heard of situational awareness before, and that's not just the color code and being aware of your surroundings. Actually knowing what's going on in your environment actually will stop, or it literally stops the element of surprise. That takes that away from the bad guy. And it could psychologically impact their motivation to attack. That's what happened to Brandon O'Rourke. He believed that he had been observed or seen, and it took away the element of surprise. Okay? So it's about deterrence, and you can do that by just watching, being aware of what's happening, and gather that information and talk about it. We talked about this. The role of law enforcement is going to change in this country. It doesn't matter where you stand, it's going to. And there are some things that should change. But at some point, the resources they have now or the resources we have from them are not going to be there at some point. I can see this coming. So understand, if we call someone, there's going to be a point where it's going to take longer. It's not that they're going to go away, because they're not. The police departments in this country are not going to go away, but there's going to be resources diverted to other places, and they're going to be limited on what they can do and what they can't do. A vulnerability assessment. So you guys kind of, and Scott can help you guys with this. Find out, based on your strategy, where you guys are weak. Like, let me ask you guys a question. You told me a little while ago that like you were told like where to go in a room. Like, if you heard gunfire right now outside in the hallway, where are you guys supposed to stand in this room? Just one person. Okay. Anywhere else?
It's always closest to the shooter. So if they're outside the door, you get closer because they don't have an angle.
Gotcha. Okay. So say again. Yeah, there's a lot of doors in here. So what do you guys think? So if you didn't know, like if you just heard gunfire, do you know what door they were close to? Huh? Yeah, the one out? Okay. So you guys know to get out. Okay. So part of this is Scott walking you guys through what you're supposed to do, and so you can remember that. Like, what are your system weaknesses, right? Situational awareness. Like, what color, don't look at Scott, look at me. What color shirt does Scott have on today? Huh? Yeah. Who didn't know that? There were some people in here that didn't know what color shirt Scott didn't have on, or Scott has on. That's just like situational awareness. You guys have looked at Scott 20 times. We've lost power 3 times. He's running back and forth. He's giving you guys the password to get on Zoom. A big part of that is just knowing what's going on around you. Okay. Say again. He does wear blue a lot. Okay. I think Carrie likes blue. And then the behavioral detection piece is something, again, Scott can tell you guys. This is not about guns. It's not about you guys fighting the adversary. I'm going to tell you right now from experience. If there's an armed person inside this room and you don't, or inside this building, and you don't have a firearm, you do need to get out. Your ability to throw a soup can at them or a chair and stop them is going to be very, very minimal. Okay. And so you notice in these active shooter events, that doesn't happen. Like, what happens is they escape, they run out of ammo. A lot of times with in some of these active shooter events, the student malfunctions the weapon and they don't know how to get the weapon back into battery. And so then someone is able to stop them because the gun doesn't work. They're no longer in control. But if the weapon's operating, to my knowledge, there hasn't been an active shooter stopped while the weapon is operating, unless it's been a law enforcement officer that has been able to respond and stop them with gunfire. Okay. So that vulnerability is, if you're in here and you're by yourself and you don't have a weapon, and you can't get out, the fight option is probably going to be pretty tough. So the most important thing with this is, number one, situational awareness. Number two, understanding what your system weaknesses are. And Scott's going to go over some of the behavioral detection stuff with you guys at some point. Okay. That's a lot. Sorry, with all the power outages we've gone over. Any questions about anything? Folks online, thank you. Thank you for bearing with us. For some reason, Middle Tennessee's having problems with power today. It's like we're in a third world country. I apologize. Questions? All right, folks, we're going to end this. Please. Yes, ma'am. If there was a shooter outside? Yep. So if I can guess that there's something happening here and I want to run away, then I would try to get as far away as I could from where I hear the sound. Yep. Yep. So it could be there if you think you could get out. Now, does that lead outside? Okay. So maybe that might not be. So if it's outside and that leads outside, maybe that's not the best, right? So if I hear it outside, and even though that door is on the other side and that leads to outside, maybe outside's not the best place to go. I would try to get away first. Like if I'm not going to fight, I would try to get away first. Yes, I would tell you, if you can, get away from it. Avoid this at all costs. Yes, ma'am. Any other? What else? You can ask questions. All right. Nothing else? Yes, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely, which is why we don't want to respond. It's why if there's behavior or there's something that you see before it happens, you report that and you're able to validate it, and it could impact their motivation to do it. Look, I'm certified to teach threat assessments for schools. There's 2 states in the United States of America that require threat assessment teams in their schools. That's Virginia and that's Washington State. And I went through Virginia's process and I also went through a private process to learn how to do it. And Virginia does it because of Virginia Tech. That's why they did it. That actually they hired, the state of Virginia hired the police chief of Virginia Tech that they hired after the attack. He was a clinical psychologist out of Iowa State. They hired him to be the police chief, put him through like a police program, swore him in, and because of his background in threat assessments, he was brought into Virginia Tech. And then several years ago, when I went through his training programs, he was a contractor for the state of Virginia. And so I went through Virginia's state program and then his private programs. And that's what stopped shooters. After the Virginia Tech massacre, he was brought in to teach Virginia Tech that, and then that went through the state of Virginia. But there's only 2 states in the country that do that. As of right now, no one else is requiring that. And that is like seeing behavior from students 2 or 3 weeks or a month before it happens. And it's not anything hard. It's just understanding what it is you're looking for. So yeah, you don't want to respond. You want to detect it early and you want to be able to stop it before it happens. And you're absolutely correct. Any other questions? Okay, folks online, thank you so much. We apologize for the power. Like I said, I'm sure it's COVID related. That COVID knocked the power out. It's so powerful. So we appreciate you guys coming on and joining us. Folks, you guys have a Lighthouse Christian. You guys have a good day. If you have any questions, Scott will answer them all. Call him at 2 o'clock in the morning. He loves to get phone calls. Okay. All right. Thank you, folks.